Hi, I'm Marshall Meyer. I'm a PhD candidate and instructor in the humanities at Johns Hopkins University, as well as a candidate scholar, a psychoanalyst in training, at the Lacanian School of Psychoanalysis. My research focuses on seriality in contemporary media and argues that psychoanalysis itself is a serial medium. In fact, that's what I'm going to be talking about today. Over the past 20 or so years, television has seen a surge in series that use the therapy session as a key narrative device. In fact, at a moment in which the public is divided as to whether television can be taken seriously as a form of art or as just another commodity, one could argue that this is the only genuinely formal contribution made by television as a medium. In the year 2000, Francis Ferguson, at that time an instructor at Johns Hopkins, made the argument that free indirect discourse, or the technique of writing out a character's first-person thoughts through the third-person voice of the narrator, was the single formal innovation made by the novel. Unlike theater or epistolary novels, the novel proper is not limited to presenting direct dialogue or mere transcriptions of the character's thoughts. But beginning with Jane Austen's Emma in 1815, narration became neither exclusively objective nor perspectival, but moved between the two with a liberty and fluidity hitherto inaccessible to writers of the world. Throughout the essay, Ferguson is adamant that this innovation be considered one of form and not of style, since that would be the preferred terminology of those who wish to elevate poetry and deny the novel its proper status as art. All this is to say is that much is at stake in whether a narrative technique is regarded as merely stylistic or elevated to the more substantial notion of representable form. It can have significant bearing on the scholarly and popular reception of the medium in which it appears, on whether that medium comes to be regarded as serious art or mere commercial entertainment. In the early 21st century, when scholars and the general public remain divided over whether television is to be considered a work of art or simply a commodity, it's worth trying the same experiment with contemporary television, sometimes known as prestige TV, peak TV, or television's second or third golden age, depending on who you ask. Does television, from roughly the turn of the millennium onward, this period celebrated by critics as the medium's most adventurous and fruitful, present us with any developments that had not already been achieved by feature-length film, whose artistic merit was once in question, just like the novels before it, but not since the publication of seminal film theory texts in the 1970s and 80s. After all, the distinguishing feature of television, its seriality, or the fact that it consists of multiple episodes cut off from one another temporally and narratively, yet connected by a common title and cast, this had already been accomplished by film serials well before the arrival of the sound era, and before that by 19th century novelists like Charles Dickens, Leo Tolstoy, George Eliot, and plenty of others. However, it just may be that one such formal feature unique to television is the way that it uses its serial form to replicate the dynamic of the psychoanalytic or psychotherapeutic clinic. So much so that in some series, like In Treatment, each episode revolves around a single therapy session. Although there's no definitive consensus as to when prestige TV began, the most commonly cited series is HBO's The Sopranos, which premiered in 1999. And although there are plenty of narrative and cinematic features that set The Sopranos apart from earlier TV, as well as the red-blooded Scorsese and Coppola-type crime drama films that the series' characters wistfully invoke and imitate, its most memorable feature remains its depiction of mobster protagonist Tony Soprano's years-long therapy for his frequent panic attacks. In some basic sense, then, what many critics and scholars recognize as the most exciting period in television's history begins in therapy. The series opens with a reluctant Tony in the waiting room of Dr. Jennifer Melfi, a psychiatrist whose portrayal earned the series an award from the American Psychoanalytic Association for the most credible psychoanalyst ever to appear in the cinema or on television. In the opening moments of their initial consultation, Tony displays some fairly typical signs of resistance. He feels fine, he tells Melfi. He does not need to be here, his recent fainting was in no way psychosomatic, and besides, he's simply immune to therapy. But when Melfi invites Tony to speculate about why he might have had this most recent panic attack, the scene switches to Tony in his home, his monologue now a non-diegetic or voiceover as he begins to vent his insecurities about the relatively dim prospects for people in his line of work compared to his father's generation.
Any thoughts at all on why you blacked out?
I don't know. Stress, maybe.
About what?
The morning of the day I got sick, I've been thinking. It's good to be in something from the ground floor. I came too late for that. I know. But lately, I'm getting the feeling that I came in at the end. The best is over.
Many Americans, I think, feel that way.
I think about my father. He never reached the heights like me. But in a lot of ways, he had it better. He had his people. They had their standards. They had pride. Today, what do we got?
For the remainder of the episode, Tony's voice will oscillate between this non-diegetic voiceover monologue, a diegetic monologue in the therapy session itself, and simply dialogue with other characters from scenes used to illustrate or contextualize points made during the session. Because of how entertaining and compelling Tony's story is, the fluidity with which the episode moves within this triplicate narrative structure is easy to overlook, but it brings to mind experimental film more readily than it does any preceding television crime drama. The therapy in The Sopranos, and the glimpse into Tony's inner life that the form affords, is especially noteworthy, and that it would have been unthinkable in these earlier feature-length crime dramas, like The Godfather or Goodfellas. As is clear from Tony's opening monologue in the series pilot, the mobsters in The Sopranos consider the characters in those films, usually played by the likes of Al Pacino and Robert De Niro, pillars of a golden age of crime long past. An age in which warring mobs had the integrity not to snitch on one another, in which those caught did their time in jail for the good of the group instead of divulging sensitive information in exchange for reduced sentences, and certainly in which mobsters did not sell out their entire group and give up all its secrets by writing a Hollywood screenplay about their adventures, a topic the series explores in its later seasons. By portraying Tony, patriarch and head of a sizable ring of crime, owning up to his depression and sobbing in front of a woman he barely knows, the series slowly and systematically emasculates a figure typically represented as transcending the limits of the law, and thereby it introduces moral and emotional ambiguity into a cinematic culture notoriously resistant to it. Now, in the spirit of Ferguson's detractors, one could argue that the abundance of therapy sessions in audiovisual narrative is neither unique to prestige TV, nor is it even unique to television at all. And to some extent, this is true. There are plenty of 20th century series like The Bob Newhart Show in the 1970s, or Dr. Katz, Professional Therapist in the 90s, that are about therapy, and the same is true of dozens of films, past and present. However, in these earlier series, therapy was little more than a hook, a plot device that allowed audiences to accompany their psychiatrist protagonists during their 9 to 5, and in which they were privy to intimate and sometimes humorous confessions from characters. But insofar as the therapeutic session can allow TV characters a space in which to step outside the hullabaloo of their lives and reflect on it, to provide the viewer with access to events mediated by their subjective experience of them, much like free and direct discourse did for characters in the novel, the therapy session as plot device begins to impact not just the story, but crucially, the way in which the story is told. In this way, the portrayal of therapy in contemporary television can indeed merit the designation of form, though it's far from the case that it always does so. This inventive use of the therapy form, I suggest, is The Sopranos' invention. But once employed in this way for the first time, the phenomenon of the televisual session spread like wildfire. So much so that the series that mediate at least some of their action through patient testimony form the lion's share of prestige series. From critically acclaimed programs like The West Wing, Mad Men, 6 Feet Under, Curb Your Enthusiasm, Fleabag, and Atlanta, to derivative, star-studded latter-day programs that failed to get renewed for a second season, like The Shrink Next Door or The Patient, the therapeutic session has become a mainstay of contemporary TV. But if cinema long precedes television, then why didn't the therapy session appear as a plot device in film, especially since film is generally more amenable to experimental form? The answer is that film is less equipped to represent the therapeutic process than television because it does not share as much with it structurally. Think about it. Both a TV show and an individual therapy session are serial, that is, constructed of distinct episodes, and go on for several years in different phases or seasons. And not only does this make the appearance of therapy more common than in film, but it's also structurally more disposed to being faithful to the messiness of the therapeutic process. television's sprawling serial form, its introduction of plot lines that it isn't sure how it's going to resolve, and showrunners regularly consulting websites like Television Without Pity or Reddit to sound out viewers. This brings to mind both psychoanalysis, which frequently meanders and follows a logic of one step forward, two steps back, but it also brings to mind a writer like Dickens, who individually contributed each passage of his work to periodicals, and even rewrote the ending to Great Expectations because he was told it was too sad. Sigmund Freud was even something of a binge reader, known to forego several hours of sleep in order to zoom through Dickens or Eliot serials. The subterranean affinity between television and therapy seems less surprising when we consider this feature of seriality undergirding both of them, and when we consider that they're all products of a Victorian-era culture. The Victorian-era aesthetic theorist whose philosophy most closely resembled feature-length film would probably be Edgar Allan Poe, who thought that a narrative had to be consumed within a single setting in order to achieve a unity of effect. For this reason, the average runtime for a feature-length film has been consistently around 100 minutes for the past several decades, which has to do with the amount of time a viewer can be expected to sit still and pay attention without getting restless. A complete psychoanalysis, on the other hand, is hundreds, if not thousands of hours long, and riddled with gaps, false starts, and unexpected setbacks. Given this formal incongruity between the unity of impression that films aspires to and the exhausting labyrinth of the psychoanalytic process, it's hardly surprising that the depiction of therapy in cinema is relatively scarce, and that what few films do depict it drastically misrepresent it, requiring the analysis to reach unexpected resolutions in short amounts of time, and thereby pushing it into the genre of melodrama. In Robert Redford's directorial debut, Ordinary People, in 1980, for instance, an upper-middle-class high schooler is sent to a therapist after attempting suicide following the death of his brother. For over half the film, his condition steadily deteriorates, to the point that eventually he's spending no time with his friends, has quit all his extracurricular activities, and is openly hostile toward his parents. But an hour into the film, the screenwriters offer a pop-Freudian deus ex machina that redirects the plot just in time for a feature-length conclusion. Take a look.
If you think I'm gonna forgive it, she's gonna forgive me. Yeah.
What?
I think I just figured something out.
What?
Who it is who can't forgive who?
Well, it's a real problem. And a real problem has a real solution.
So, the boy makes a slip of the tongue in the therapist's office, upon which he stares pensively out the window, has a revelation to the tune of Pachelbel's canon, and suddenly summons the courage to confront his unfeeling mother and cut ties with her just before the moviegoer starts becoming antsy in her seat. Or sometimes, if time does not permit, the therapist will force the discovery himself. By far the most famous film in this vein is Good Will Hunting in 1997, with its well-known scene in which the therapist, played by Robin Williams, repeats the phrase, "It's not your fault," until Will, played by screenwriter Matt Damon, is clutching him in tears. The therapy terminates on a positive note shortly thereafter, as Will takes off for California to chase down his girlfriend at medical school. All this to say, what few films do include therapy usually sentimentalize the process, using a confrontation or a slip of the tongue to precipitate profound shifts in a character's psychic economy in an unrealistic amount of time, instead of allowing therapy to be the long, discursive, free association of signifiers it needs to be, both in order to sneak up on the unconscious, as it were, and to truly help people whose unconscious conflict causes them suffering. Following the pilot of The Sopranos, the rest of the series will dampen the complexity of this storytelling device, no longer allowing Tony's monologue to take the form of a voiceover, but by showing his voiceover monologue literally growing out of his therapy session. The pilot of The Sopranos illustrates an important point, that certain programs can be said to belong to a general therapy paradigm without themselves literally taking place in therapy. Hence, On my reading, series like The Sopranos and In Treatment are but exceptional cases of a larger televisual trend, literalized versions of a wider formal shift in therapy's relationship to the psychology of its characters. In order to properly register this shift, one need only compare adult animation, a typically light-hearted genre, from the 2010s and 2020s with those from the immediately preceding decades. The scatological humor and heavy-handed racial jokes of South Park and Family Guy have suddenly given way to the harrowing tales of drug addiction and depression in BoJack Horseman, or the quantum leaps and mental gymnastics required to keep up with Rick and Morty. And these new, refreshingly complex series are filled with creative plot devices that mimic the therapeutic session, not literally but formally. All of which suggests that the therapy paradigm is characterized not by any common feature at the level of content, but by a certain kind of formal televisual apostrophe, one in which the back and forth of character dialogue gives way to a single character's free flow of signifiers directed toward a quiet but active listener. Sometimes an actual therapist within the diegetic space of the series, but not exclusively. Contemporary TV abounds with creative plot devices that recreate these pockets of therapeutic intimacy within the televisual narrative. One of the highest-rated episodes of BoJack Horseman on IMDb, for instance, features a rakish alcoholic BoJack standing at a podium, delivering what is supposed to be a eulogy for his late mother, but turns out to be a 20-minute free associative monologue that alights upon fantasies and memories of his tortured childhood. Likewise, the unnamed protagonist in Fleabag frequently breaks the fourth wall to divulge her innermost feelings directly into the camera, with no one else in the series, aside from a priest with whom she eventually falls in love, able to notice this lapse in diegetic consistency. Although she does undergo therapy in one episode with a free therapy voucher given to her by her father, in the series' highly celebrated second season, she enters a relationship with this priest that has a sort of transference to it, and she agrees to undergo confession with him and practice worship in a Quaker meeting house, both ceremonies that, by making possible a free association of thoughts and desires, place the protagonist in a position akin to the televisual patient. Hence, series like these ought to be considered as taking part in this therapy paradigm, even if they don't lay their characters down on a couch. Fleabag's protagonist staring directly into the eyes of the camera helps illustrate why and how the most masterfully psychoanalytic television might not feature a therapist at all, because we, the viewer, stand in for one. The French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan describes the role of the psychoanalyst as one of playing dead, that is, listening attentively session after session and expressing an unflagging desire for the patient to explore difficult topics, but never inserting any of herself into the relationship in the form of personal comments or prescriptive statements. This is what makes psychoanalysis stand out relative to the more garden variety kinds of therapy that developed out of it and are all the rage now in the United States. By disclosing personal information about themselves, about their hobbies, their family lives, or their own mental activity, therapists wish to humanize themselves and appear less menacing to patients, but in doing so, they undermine their potential to establish this transference. As Lacan's schema L illustrates, those who endeavor to present themselves to their patient's ego as just another human being, or what Lacan writes here as the little imaginary other, they sacrifice their ability to reach the subject of the unconscious as the symbolic, big other, which is where they need to be situated in order to help bring about deep, lasting changes in their patient's psychic economies. In the context of actual therapy, it's easy to see why. Therapists who share personal information with their patients and give in to demands for concrete advice, or ego psychologists, as Lacan somewhat dismissively called them, set up a corrective normative relationship, where the success of the therapy is to be judged by the patient's ability to model their sick ego on the therapist's healthy one. And knowing concrete information about one's therapist restricts the kinds of projection and free association the patient is free to engage in. That is, the kind of symbolic fictions the patient is free to project onto their analyst. We typically think of projection as something problematic, but in the clinic it's actually a tremendous asset. For example, if the patient seems to be making an assumption as to what they imagine their therapist's religion, political affiliation, or lifestyle choices to be, the therapist can only invite the patient to reflect on why they made such an assumption if they have no factual basis for it. Playing dead. has there ever been a better description of the television viewer, who's deeply invested in the characters of a series, often to the point of testifying to unique and personal connections with them, even as she consciously knows them to be the brainchildren of a writer's room, but who remains separated from these characters by a screen and unable to relate to them in any tangible way? By turning on the TV, one effectively invites people into their home. But these people are spatially and temporally disconnected from oneself, and except in the case of reality television, they're not who they claim to be. One pays a visit to these characters on a serial basis, one episode after another, much in the same way that an analyst and patient meet, and thereby gains a familiarity and degree of intimacy with them that cannot be said of the movie-going public. The viewer shares with the analyst this asymmetrical relationship. In the case of psychoanalysis, one party lies down, looks up at the ceiling, and speaks freely and discursively, while the other positions herself outside of their line of vision and plays dead, punctuating the patient's speech with nothing but oracular questions and interjections, and deciding when the session has come to an end. It's not a coincidence, therefore, that both psychoanalysis and television viewing have become forever associated with the same piece of furniture, the couch. Lacan even criticized terminology like countertransference, which imply a reciprocal relationship between the feelings of the analysand or patient and those of the analyst. This is not to say that the analyst is working with a kind of Zen, imperturbable calm. Of course, being privy to someone's deepest fears and desires is going to stir up complicated emotions in oneself. But because of this asymmetrical relationship, as well as the fact that the analyst has been through her own analysis, it undermines the radicality of psychoanalysis to characterize these emotions as reciprocal. The relationship between television characters and the viewers who watch them is similarly asymmetrical. In either case, one party is exclusively watched and the other exclusively watching. By playing dead, playing the symbolic role of the big other for the TV character, the viewer can even have an effect on the character similar to what an analyst would, tripping up the character's speech and causing the unconscious to erupt in the form of slips of the tongue. One can best see this dynamic at work in mockumentary cringe comedies whose characters consciously acknowledge the fact of the camera, like the BBC's The Office, about which I'll have more to say in just a moment. Moviegoers have been aware of this connection between the mockumentary form and cringe comedy ever since Rob Reiner's This Is Spinal Tap in 1984. Yet without psychoanalytic theory, one would not be able to articulate this affinity. We can think of the mockumentary as a subspecies of the therapy paradigm, one where the camera or viewer occupies a role akin to the analyst, drawing confessions out of characters that go beyond their conscious intentions. This misalignment between the characters' intended, imaginary, egoic self-presentation and their bungled execution, which cannot but produce a kind of secondhand embarrassment in the viewer situated in the comfort of her own home, would, in the clinic, be the perfect opportunity for the analyst to intervene, to invite the patient to reflect on the gap between their conscious and unconscious intentions. Cringe comedy is therefore a sort of psychoanalysis in public, a formal achievement on the part of television to move from the ego to the subject of the unconscious. HBO actually played on this analogy between viewer and analyst with its advertising campaign for the first season of In Treatment, which featured 5 different therapist-patient configurations. It spreads these episodes out across the 5 days of the week, Monday through Friday, and the poster displayed a weekly calendar with the 5 patients pictured, each of them at 9:30. Significantly, the series creators did not specify whether this was 9:30 a.m. or p.m., as is customary on TV advertisements. Of course, the ad reads 5 nights a week, and anyone who sees the poster will know that a new episode of a popular TV show would only appear at 9:30 p.m. But 9:30 a.m. is the beginning of a workday and a popular time to see one's analyst. Thus, by omitting the indicator of ante or post-meridian, the advertisers highlighted this perception that the viewer is playing the role of analyst, inviting these patients into their homes, just as the therapists do on screen. Many theorists who approach film from the perspective of phenomenology, as well as many films themselves, from Wim Wenders' Alice in the Cities to Krzysztof Kieslowski's Camera Buff, they all advance the idea that photography petrifies its subject and thus amounts to death, whereas film depicts the subject in motion and so bespeaks life. Very few note the inverse operation, however, that the becoming alive of characters on a video screen makes the spectator feel dead in comparison, or at least stuck in a much more static dimension than the one in which the bustling activity of the program is taking place. My adaptation of the concept of playing dead to audiovisual narrative is an attempt to rectify this oversight. And of course, it's not only the person on the dead end of this relationship, whether analyst or spectator, who is tempted to try and bypass this mediation. For evidence of this fact, consider that Tony Soprano only makes it to the 4th episode of The Sopranos before paying a visit to a shady detective to find out whatever he can about his reticent psychiatrist. So, we've seen how effortlessly series fold the therapy session into their narratives, but now let's see an actual example of this psychoanalysis in public. Perhaps the greatest such series is the original British version of The Office, which is as merciless as the best of an analyst's in its dissection of the psyche of office manager David Brent. Consider, for instance, a scene in which, acutely conscious that his character will be immortalized by the BBC, David attempts to cement his image as a humanitarian while the office is having a comedy day to raise money for charity. He begins his monologue by presenting himself as a funny, eminently charitable boss.
Sure, there's people watching this now going, "Oi, Brent, why are you still bothering with comic relief? They're always doing it and there's still people starving. That's why I'm still doing it."
If The Office were an ordinary workplace documentary, here, where David points to the camera and demonstrates his ego-level identification with the position of corporate philanthropist, would be an appropriate place to conclude the scene. However, by refusing to cut the scene and instead filling it with dead air, the mockumentarian functions like a Lacanian analyst, who doesn't end the session precisely on the hour, because that would allow the patient to unconsciously plan out the session in advance and never allow the unconscious to surface and catch oneself by surprise. But by keeping the camera rolling, this Lacanian mockumentarian allows the monologue to take an unexpected turn.
You know, and I hear people go, "Oh no, the money just goes to hungry foreigners." Not true. A lot of it stays in this country, you know, goes to homegrown problem, AKA the disableds. You know, a lot of money goes to these fellas. No, I'm not saying it goes to you, know. If you don't need it, do you? You're working. But if you do claim for it, you might probably claim for other stuff, and that's up to you, as long as you don't abuse the system, you know. Sadly, a lot of them are.
Although David's monologue began from the place of the ego, demonstrating his largesse, it ends with an eruption of the subject of the unconscious, which in this case communicates the exact opposite sentiment, a tired, Thatcherite critique of the welfare state. What we learn through this process is that David's charitable veneer is merely a cover-up for the stingy, conservative person he doesn't want anyone to know that he is. What is repressed will always make itself felt in the form of symptoms, denials, and long-winded prevarications. And psychoanalysis is a place where the unconscious is allowed the chance to speak. Now, you might remark that this experience hardly comes off as therapeutic, whether for David himself or for us watching on, cringing. If anything, it's uncomfortable. But this gets us at precisely what makes psychoanalysis a radical transformation of how we think about mental health. Psychoanalysis is, unlike therapy, necessarily uncomfortable. It's a theory that we come into the world without having given our consent, and then, utterly helpless and dependent on others, certain things happen to us that are so unspeakably traumatic that we have to carve out this recess in our minds in which to repress these traumatic experiences. That recess is what Freud called the unconscious. So it necessarily follows that as you approach repressed material that you've organized your entire life around trying to avoid, you become more anxious, as David does here, as he slowly realizes that perhaps he's not as charitable and enlightened as he'd like to think that he is. This might cause him some consternation, but psychoanalysis is more interested in truth than it is in so-called mental health, which neither Freud nor Lacan really believe in. As Samuel Beckett put it, "You're on Earth, there's no cure for that." This might genuinely serve as the starting point for a clinician. Something we'll never understand brought us into the world with no why and wherefore, and there's no reason to assume that there's some inherent creationist harmony between the individual and their environment, and therefore no such thing as being well-adjusted to that environment. But there's something exciting about discovering that there are all kinds of roiling conflicts and contradictions within you, that you have drives and energies that aren't politically correct, that may be violent or even murderous. Psychoanalysis and certain exemplary works of art get us in touch with this unconscious side of the human condition. If you feel better as a result of confronting these contradictions within yourself, great, many people do. but that isn't the goal of this kind of therapy. To better understand what I mean when I say that human beings are inherently contradictory creatures, consider a scene from the last real episode of the series. Despite the fact that corporate has recently laid David off for incompetence, he's being interviewed by a journalist and betrays the same egomania and wildly unrealistic self-image that have always made him such a cringeworthy character. When she asks about his love life, listen to how he responds.
Private life then, just to flesh out David Brent the man, is there a better half?
David quipped, "Why buy a book when you can join a library?"
So you play the field?
Well, I'm not going around like using chicks and shit, but I'm just, chilling out while I'm young, I suppose. So.
And is there a chick in tow at the moment?
Oh, I don't kiss and tell.
I'm just trying to find out if you're in a relationship at the moment.
Well, Brent says no comment.
Right, so you don't have a girlfriend?
Wow. What is a girlfriend? Yeah.
I don't know, someone you'd have sex with?
Oh, I don't get coarse in a magazine for the public. I don't think you win a Pulitzer for filth.
At first glance, what strikes a nerve in this scene is David's sense that the interviewer is gradually starting to discover who he really is, a bachelor in his late 30s with no job or romantic prospects. However, this kind of depth psychology is not psychoanalysis, but a caricature. Psychoanalysis does not endeavor to discover the secret truth of a human being, beneath all their resistances and ego identifications, but to realize that subjectivity is itself nothing but a series of such demands, some of them mutually exclusive. By maintaining that wishful impulses in the unconscious are exempt from mutual contradiction, psychoanalysis therefore confounds the law of non-contradiction, on which philosophy had been based at least since Aristotle. Now, typically, one compartmentalizes these conflictual impulses into different areas of one's life, thereby lending an appearance of consistency to one's self-image. However, when David here tries to realize them both at the same time, in this case by presenting himself as a reckless ladies' man and a responsible gentleman, and feeling as if he's failing at both, what makes us cringe is our recognition that we too are full of these psychological catch-22s, and that this is what it means to be a human being. What we find cringeworthy in such a scene is its uncanny proximity to our own impossible desires. Let's look at one final example, just moments later when an employee who's leaving the company asks for a word with David.
That's why my professionalism is probably only as important as my humanism.
Hi, I just wondered if you got any time for a little chat?
I've always got time for my staff, Dawn. You know that. He's always got time for staff.
Just before you go...
Even though a lot happening and his mind should be on other stuff, he still... Shoot.
Where before David was concerned with how he'll be remembered as a man, here he is trying to secure his image as a boss. Simultaneously in a position of power too important to deal individually with the hoi polloi, yet somehow deigning to listen to the concerns of a lowly receptionist. Taken on their own, both fantasies leave something to be desired. One risks making David look like he lives in an ivory tower, disconnected from his salt-of-the-earth subordinates, while the other makes his position of power look insubstantial, as if he's too bogged down in the concerns of individual employees to make important executive-level decisions. Again, it is his frenzy to secure both mutually exclusive ends of this fantasy at once, and his creeping sense that he's failing to do so, as he continually looks up at the camera in panic, that invites the viewer's uneasy laughter. Unlike with more run-of-the-mill comedy, one cannot but feel implicated in the punchlines of The Office, as viewers recognize that these antinomies of everyday life, the wish to be perceived as both freewheeling and loyal, powerful and personable, are part and parcel of the human condition as such. It's in this way that a series like The Office, despite not featuring any therapy at all, formally replicates the dynamic of the psychoanalytic clinic and offers something therapeutic to the viewer, albeit not in the way we typically think of therapy. To conclude, we should note that this is just one way of looking at the therapeutic effects of television. We could have also talked about how, for psychoanalysis, human subjects of language necessarily live in a state of lack, of unsatisfied desire that gets us up out of bed in the morning, but which we also routinely misperceive as something that can and should be satiated, especially in a late capitalist epoch that exploits our lack and offers us endless products and services by means of which we might fill it up. Because television is serial, it runs on lack in a way that film does not. Characters cannot get what they want and walk off into the distance because if they do, there will be no more story left to tell, which is every network's nightmare. And certain exemplary series, in particular from the highly episodic genre of the sitcom, thematize this repetitive nature of the medium, showing us that while there may be frustration in our lack, so too is there enjoyment. How else to account for the immense and enduring popularity of series from the giddily aimless 1990s, like Seinfeld, whose principal appeal was their depiction of a core group of blasé friends and a rotating array of attractive but evanescent supporting cast members, whose failure to satisfy the leads was written into their role from the start. The enjoyment the viewer vicariously derives from watching these characters routinely fail to find lasting satisfaction in their careers and romantic lives serves as a kind of therapy for a human subject prone to misperceiving their desire as something satiable. Or we could have gone in a much darker direction, as many scholars of media are inclined to do, talking about how television, and in particular, the streaming era and binge culture, are a source of capitalist ideology, deprogramming human beings' critical capacities and inundating them with so much content that they're anesthetized to the fact that, for say, income inequality is worse than it's been since 1913, when the planet was on the brink of the First World War. And there's absolutely a kernel of truth to this kind of reading, which sees our engagement with media as being at least as harmful to the collective as it is therapeutic to the individual. I refrain in my own work from making sociological pronouncements, evaluations, and prescriptions when it comes to television. For all I know, maybe we should throw out our TVs, which, believe it or not, people actually debated doing in the 1970s. Rather, my work is predicated on the idea that despite the fact that television is steeped in the market more than any other art commodity in human history, it occasionally, rarely, but still sometimes, transcends its commodity character and offers the viewer something irreducible to it. What makes works of art unique among commodities and what prompts humanists to pore over them in the way that we do is that they are not reducible to their use value, but they possess a meaning, one that is rarely visible on the surface, not at least in the cases of great art. In this sense, despite a growing anti-psychoanalytic sentiment in the humanities during the past few decades, anyone who engages seriously with a work, asking questions like, what does this mean, rather than the more superficial or consumerist questions like, do I like this? Do I identify with this work in an imaginary sort of way? Anyone who asks these bigger questions is, in an unmistakable sense, practicing psychoanalysis, regardless of how they may feel about the names like Freud and Lacan or terms like the Oedipus complex. The text, like the patient, contains an unconscious, and that's what we're trying to uncover when we undertake these close readings.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to now join you live for the Q&A. I'm really excited to answer the questions you've been leaving in the chat. I also encourage anyone who hasn't yet left their comments to do so. I'm happy to answer as many as I can. Now, we have a number so far. I'm going to begin with a couple questions from Cindy. Her first question is, do you think the therapy's depiction in pop culture, in television and film, helped it become destigmatized or lead to the recent increased focus on mental health? This is a fantastic question. I think there's, of course, the problem of causation. Did the depiction of therapy in media cause therapy to become destigmatized, or did the destigmatization cause it to appear in so many programs? But nevertheless, it certainly is becoming destigmatized, which I think is, on the whole, a great thing for culture. I just wish that psychoanalysis in particular would become more well-known and well-practiced in the United States. It's a lot more popular in Europe and in South America. And as I tried to show with my with the rather complicated chart from Lacan, the schema L, there's a way in which what psychoanalysis does is not just different from, but kind of fundamentally opposed to what therapy does. There's a difference between building up the ego and trying to destroy the ego to get away at its defense mechanisms and towards the subject of the unconscious. So I hope that things will continue to move in a more psychoanalytic direction. But I think on the whole, the destigmatization of therapy is a really fantastic start for our culture. And Cindy asked, I believe, a second question. If you had to visit a TV therapist, which would you choose? And she says, I'd be up to visit Dr. Fraser Crane for sure. I think that's a really interesting question, one I've never thought about before. I like Jennifer Malfi from The Sopranos. Um, there are times when I feel that she intervenes in Tony's life more than I would like my analyst to do, or more than I would do myself as an analyst. As far as I'm concerned, the more minimal, the better. Um, Fraser Crane is good in this respect as well. But I would maybe say that I would most prefer the non-existent therapists in, say, Fleabag, the therapist who says nothing at all because they're not technically there. Again, I think the more minimal, the better. Let's see. Okay, we've got another one from Danny just now. Looking at it from the side of the therapist, do you think there's a role for TV and media as a tool for prescription therapists could use to help patients? I would certainly hope that the destigmatization of mental health awareness on television would encourage people to speak to therapists. And I do argue here that I believe that there's something therapeutic that television does on the whole. But I think there's also a singularity to individuals' problems that cannot be experienced vicariously through other people's or other characters, in this case, experiences. And for that reason, I do think there are limitations to the therapy paradigm. One of the problems, for example, with these dream books, for example, that exist that try to say, if you had a dream about your teeth falling out, this means you have an anxiety about X, Y, or Z. One of the problems about these kinds of one-to-one translations is that they don't respect the utter singularity of human beings' experiences. And the fact that for, to take another example, if somebody has a dream about a red pickup truck, it's going to mean something very different based on whether someone received a red pickup truck as their first car from their father, or whether something horrible and traumatic happened to them inside a red pickup truck when they were a kid. And so for that reason, I think those kinds of examples point to the limitations of the therapy paradigm, although they can encourage us to think like an analyst and see ourselves from the position of the analyst. I don't know whether they can respect the singularity of our own problems and our own experiences. I believe we have one more from Danny as well. Do you think there's room for new frontiers in this paradigm with very new media versus legacy media? That is, content creators on social media platforms like YouTube, TikTok, etc. This is an interesting question. I'm not quite as familiar with social media and newer media as I am with television. I'd like to become more well acquainted with it, but I do know about one influencer, I guess. I think his name is Kyle the Therapy Gecko. I don't know if anyone's heard of this. He's a guy who has over 1 million followers on Instagram, and he dresses up like a gecko and he paints his face green, and he has people call in and tell them about their problems, and he responds in ways that are funny and sometimes helpful, and people get some kind of vicarious satisfaction from watching him speak. I think that's maybe an example. I would say, to go back to the beginning of the presentation, I would hope that were, or I would think that that's an example of the therapy paradigm being used in a more gimmicky fashion. It's not genuinely formal in the way that it is in The Sopranos, but to the extent that it helps people on a day-to-day basis, I think that's maybe a good model for the way the therapy paradigm could be used in other newer media, in particular in social media. Let's see, we've got a couple others. George asked, what role does silence and stillness, hallmarks of Samuel Beckett's style, play in a television format compared to theater or film? I don't have a pointed answer to this question, but I'm just going to free associate on it a little bit. People, a lot of people don't know that before the sound film or the talkie came into existence, I believe in 1927, it was customary to talk during a film. It was only when there began to be dialogue in films that people stopped talking during the movie. And it was only really in the late 50s, early 60s that people watched a film from the very beginning to the very end. Frequently, people would just go to the cinema all day and they would start a film in the middle. And they would watch, 3.5 films that day or something. So this kind of sense of total immersion and absorption in the work is relatively new. And in theater, I guess, theater is slightly different because the presence of the spectator in theater gives the program a different feel. It has what German theorist Walter Benjamin calls an aura. There's an aura in theater that's sort of destroyed in cinema. Benjamin thinks this is a good thing, actually, but I think it's the presence of the spectator is certainly still relevant in theater as well. But neither cinema nor theater, are serial forms in the way that television is. And I think that formal congruity, let's say, between the serial form of television and the psychotherapeutic, psychoanalytic process, seeing someone on a regular basis every week in the same way that you watch your favorite characters every week. I think these two forms map onto one another in a way that they don't quite do in other media. But I would be very curious to see films, or especially, I can't think of any plays I've ever seen that have incorporated the psychoanalytic session. Well, actually, there's a recent play that came out by a woman who was psychoanalyzed by Jacques Lacan. And she, I believe it started as an off-Broadway play and has since been adapted into a film. But I'll think more about that question. I don't have I hope that's a satisfying enough answer. And we have time for one more question. And this is a question from Jensen, who writes, do you think media that utilizes breaking the fourth wall moments like Fleabag engage the audience better within the character's psyche than simply seeing a therapy scene playing out, a la Tony Soprano, which is maybe why we see significantly more media using that? That's a really well-formed question. I totally agree. I think yes. I think paradoxically, programs that do not include a therapist and a patient within the diegesis, they're paradoxically better at reproducing the experience. And the reason for that is that in the absence of an actual therapist and patient embedded into the space, we are forced to assume that role ourselves as viewers. So, for example, Fleabag is a tremendous series, and it concludes with, well, there are so many things you could say psychoanalytically about the series, about the sort of repetition compulsion that Fleabag engages in, or the protagonist who, I believe the unnamed protagonist that people always assume is named Fleabag, but I don't think it's ever clarified. I almost think we're never told Fleabag's name because she's so close to us. It's almost like the only reason we have names is that there are many people on Earth, and we have to distinguish between different people. But if there were only 2 people on Earth, you would never call anyone another name. But Fleabag engages in kind of repetition compulsions. She loses her mother, she loses her best friend, and then she falls in love with a priest who is the only human being who's contractually obliged not to love her back. So she engages in this kind of desire to repeat her traumatic experiences, and arguably her experience with the viewer is comparable to a kind of therapy or an analysis. And there's eventually a stunning moment in which the priest with whom she falls in love is able to notice the fact that she's disappearing momentarily as she talks to the viewer. He's the only character who's ever able to notice that, to get past this superficial layer of her personality. And ultimately, I think the series kind of concludes with the end of therapy, the end of psychoanalysis, as Jacques Lacan kind of conceptualized it. So all this to say, I totally agree, Jensen, and I think that yes, weirdly, paradoxically, the refusal to include a therapist forces us to assume that role, and thus kind of heightens the stakes of what the therapy is capable of achieving. Anyway, it looks like we're out of time for this session, so I'll wrap things up this afternoon. I'd just like to thank everyone who tuned in to listen to the lecture, and I hope that you found it interesting. I'd also like to thank Hopkins at Home for helping with this recording and broadcast, and I encourage everyone to check out their other free public virtual lectures by visiting hopkinsathome.jhu.edu. Thank you, everyone, and I hope you have a wonderful night.